Have you ever wondered why, when the news announces a new conflict on the other side of the world, the stock tickers for certain companies light up green, surging skyward? Why are images of ruined cities and human suffering so often juxtaposed with graphs of soaring share prices and reports of record-breaking profits? We're taught to think of war as the ultimate tragedy, a failure of diplomacy and humanity. And that is true. But there is another side to the story, a side they don't show you on the evening news, a side where war isn't just about politics or ideology, but is, first and foremost, a business, a vast, incredibly profitable and perfectly engineered business. Today, we're going to embark on a journey through the history of the 20th and 21st centuries. But this won't be a simple recitation of dates and battles. We are going to put on the glasses of a financial analyst and look at America's most famous conflicts, not from the perspective of geopolitics, but from the perspective of money. We will see how the United States, a nation that began with a deep-seated desire for isolation, transformed into a global superpower whose economic might became inextricably linked to its military prowess. We will uncover how a system was built in which peacetime means stagnation for entire sectors of the economy, while a new conflict represents a new opportunity for growth. This is the story of how war ceased to be a mere instrument of policy and became an engine of the economy itself. This is the story of how America turned war into a financial opportunity. Prepare yourself, because the numbers and facts you are about to hear might permanently change the way you view the world. Let's transport ourselves back to the early 20th century. America is a country of immense industrial potential, but it still clings to the policy of isolationism championed by its founding fathers. The Great Depression then delivers a devastating blow to this industrial machine. Smokestacks stand silent, millions are unemployed, and the economy is in a free fall. Government programs, Franklin D. Roosevelt's famous New Deal, help, but they can't fully restart the stalled engine. And then, a fire begins to rage in Europe, the Second World War. Initially, America tries to stay out of it, but as Nazi Germany conquers one nation after another, it becomes clear that staying on the sidelines is not an option. And here we arrive at the first pivotal moment in our story, the Lend-Lease Act. Officially, this was a program to aid the Allies. America supplied Great Britain and later the Soviet Union with weapons, food, technology, and raw materials. But what did this mean for the American economy? It was a colossal government order. The very factories that had been idle just yesterday were now awarded contracts to produce tanks, planes, ships, and ammunition for years to come. General Motors stopped making passenger cars and started manufacturing tanks and aircraft. Ford's assembly lines were retooled to build bombers. Shipyards operated in 3 shifts around the clock. Millions of unemployed Americans found jobs in war production. The government was pouring billions of dollars into the economy, not as handouts, but as payment for tangible goods. The economy, which had been unable to recover from the Depression, suddenly roared to life, growing at an unprecedented rate. And then came Pearl Harbor, and America officially entered the war. This triggered an even greater mobilization of the economy. The entire nation was put on a war footing. And while Europe and Asia lay in smoldering ruins, American industry operated at full capacity, its homeland untouched by the destruction. By the end of the war, the United States was responsible for nearly half of the world's industrial output. It emerged from the conflict not just as a victor, but as the only major power whose economy had not only survived, but had become immeasurably stronger. The war had literally pulled the country out of the Great Depression, and from this, the main conclusion of this block is born. World War II demonstrated to the American establishment a simple and seductive formula. Massive military spending is a powerful stimulus for economic growth. An entire industry, a whole ecosystem of industrial giants, research institutions, and government agencies was created, all fine-tuned for the purpose of war. This gave rise to a term that President Dwight D. Eisenhower would later coin in his farewell address, the military-industrial complex, a system comprising the military, politicians, and corporations, all mutually interested in the perpetual expansion of military power. But what do you do when the biggest war in history is over? What do you do with those colossal factories? Where do the millions of workers go? You can't just switch this machine off. Doing so would risk a new economic crisis. The machine needed a new purpose, a new fuel source, a new enemy to keep it running. And very soon, that enemy was found. An enemy that would allow the economy to be maintained in a state of permanent mobilization for the next 40 years. Musical transition. So, World War II came to an end. In its place came the Cold War. There was no direct confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union, but there was constant tension, a relentless arms race, and a series of proxy wars fought all over the globe. And for the military-industrial complex forged during World War II, this was the ideal state of affairs. It eliminated the need for a total war that depletes all of a nation's resources. Instead, it allowed for a state of permanent readiness, which demanded constant and enormous infusions of cash into the defense industry. Let's look at a specific example: the Vietnam War. Officially, America intervened to stop the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, based on the famous domino theory, the idea that if one country fell, others in the region would follow. But let's examine the economic side of the coin. The Vietnam War became a goldmine for American defense corporations. This was the first helicopter war. Companies like Bell Helicopter received contracts for thousands upon thousands of their iconic Huey helicopters. Aircraft manufacturers like McDonnell Douglas supplied fleets of Phantom fighter jets. Chemical giants like Dow Chemical produced napalm and the infamous Agent Orange, a defoliant used to destroy jungle cover, which led to horrific long-term health consequences for millions. Every bullet fired, every sortie flown, every bomb dropped was a product, paid for by the U.S. government with taxpayer money. The war dragged on for years, and for all that time, the defense orders never stopped. It was a continuous river of money. Furthermore, the war served as a real-world testing ground for new types of weaponry and tactics. It was a proving ground that someone else paid for. It's crucial to understand that, unlike World War II, the Vietnam War did not require the mobilization of the entire economy. The rest of the country went about its business, while the defense sector thrived. This was a new model, where war became a background process, constant, simmering, and immensely profitable. And here we arrive at our second major conclusion. The military-industrial complex learned to survive and prosper not just in conditions of world war, but in a state of perpetual, low-grade conflict. The ideological struggle against the Soviet Union became the perfect justification for maintaining a gigantic military budget. Any regional conflict anywhere in the world could be framed as a battle in the global struggle against communism, thus requiring American intervention and, consequently, American weapons. The system had learned to convert ideology into contracts. Profit was generated not from victory. After all, a war could be prolonged indefinitely, but from the very process of waging war. The longer the conflict, the more helicopters, bullets, and bombs could be sold. But in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the unthinkable happened. The great enemy, the one that had justified the existence of this massive machine for 40 years, simply vanished. The Soviet Union collapsed, the Berlin Wall fell, the Cold War was over. A moment arrived that was dubbed the peace dividend. It seemed that the vast sums spent on defense could now be redirected to healthcare, education, and infrastructure. Military factories could be retooled for civilian production, but a machine built for war did not want to stop. It just needed a new enemy. And soon, that enemy was found. An enemy far more elusive, omnipresent, and most importantly, unbeatable. A new era dawned. After the collapse of the USSR, it briefly seemed the world would become a safer place. But for a system built on conflict, peace is a crisis. And at the beginning of the 21st century, the perfect new enemy emerged: international terrorism. Following the events of September 11, 2001, a war on terror was declared. And this concept proved to be even more convenient for the military-industrial complex than the rivalry with the USSR. Why? Because the Soviet Union had clear borders, a defined army, and a political leadership. It was a tangible enemy. But terrorism is an idea, a tactic. It has no capital city to capture, no army with which to sign a surrender. And if you can never definitively defeat the enemy, then the war against it can be eternal, and eternally profitable. Let's consider the most striking example of this era, the 2003 invasion of Iraq. The official pretext was Saddam Hussein's possession of weapons of mass destruction, which, as we now know, were never found. But let's look at what happened from an economic standpoint. The Iraq War was the pinnacle of a new model, the privatization of war. If the government had previously ordered weapons from corporations, it now began to order the war itself from them. Private military companies, or PMCs, emerged. The most famous was Blackwater, whose employees were essentially mercenaries, performing tasks like guarding convoys, diplomats, and facilities. They were paid enormous sums of money while operating outside the traditional system of military justice. But the privatization went even further. Corporations like Halliburton and its subsidiary KBR received multi-billion-dollar no-bid contracts. For what? For everything. For logistics, for building military bases, for delivering food and fuel, for doing the soldiers' laundry, and even for running the chow halls. In essence, a significant portion of the functions previously performed by the Army itself was outsourced to private companies, and their services cost many times more. It was a modern-day gold rush. Every aspect of the war, from combat operations to daily life support, was transformed into a commercial service. Then came the reconstruction of Iraq phase, and the very same companies that supplied equipment for the country's destruction were awarded contracts for its rebuilding, constructing roads, oil pipelines, schools. It was the perfect circular business model. First, you get paid to break it, then you get paid to fix it. And all of it was funded by the American taxpayer. Billions, hundreds of billions of dollars were spent in Iraq and Afghanistan, with a huge portion of that money ending up in the accounts of private corporations. And here is our third and final conclusion. In the 21st century, the system didn't just adapt, it evolved. The military-industrial complex transformed into a military-industrial security complex. Profit is now extracted not only from manufacturing weapons, but from providing a full spectrum of war-related services. War has become a turnkey product, and the concept of a war on terror has provided a perpetual justification for it all. The enemy can be anywhere. A threat can emerge at any moment, and therefore, the machine must run non-stop, consuming trillions of dollars and creating new markets in conflict zones. This model has proven so effective that we see its echoes today in various hotspots around the globe. The system has learned not just to exploit wars, but to create and sustain the conditions for them, because for this machine, peace is a lost business opportunity. Now, let's piece this entire puzzle together. We have witnessed a three-stage evolution. Stage 1. World War II, which created the machine itself, the military-industrial complex, and proved that massive defense spending could be a cure for economic depression. The precedent was set. Stage 2. The Cold War. The machine learned to operate not in a mode of total war, but in a mode of constant low-level ideological conflict, securing a steady stream of contracts for decades. Profit was extracted from the process, not the outcome. And Stage 3, the modern era, the war on terror. The system reached its perfected form. It learned to privatize war, turning it into a service industry, and found itself an eternal, elusive enemy to justify infinite military budgets. So what does all this mean for you and me? It means that when we hear calls in the news for a new military intervention, for the defense of democracy, or for the fight against the latest threat, it is worth asking ourselves a simple question. Cui bono, which in Latin means who benefits, because behind the loud political slogans and patriotic rhetoric, there is very often a cold, hard financial calculation. There are powerful forces for whom war is not a tragedy, but a business plan. For whom human lives are collateral damage and destroyed countries are emerging markets. This system affects everything. It drains trillions of dollars from the national budget that could be spent on healthcare, on fighting poverty, on scientific research and education. It creates a perpetual demand for conflict, which means that diplomacy and peaceful negotiations are often sidelined because there is no profit in peace. It manufactures an image of an enemy, be it a communist or a terrorist, to justify its own existence. It is a vicious cycle where fear generates budgets, budgets generate weapons, and the existence of advanced weapons creates an incentive to find a place to use them. So what can be done? Are we powerless against this massive machine? No. The first and most important weapon we have is knowledge. Understanding how this system works already robs it of some of its power. When you know that behind the news of a distant war may lie someone's commercial interest, you begin to consume information critically. You start asking questions. You seek out alternative sources. Do not be a passive consumer of the news. Be curious about which companies receive defense contracts. Follow how politicians vote on military budgets and see who funds their election campaigns. Support independent journalism that conducts investigations and shines a light into these dark corners. And most importantly, talk about it. Discuss it with your friends and family. The more people who understand that war is not just geopolitics but also big business, the harder it will be to manipulate public opinion and justify new and endless conflicts. The story I've told you is not a conspiracy theory. It is an analysis of a system that has developed over decades and operates according to its own economic laws. Changing this system is a long and difficult road, but it begins with a simple step. It begins with our awareness that peace is worth fighting for, not only on the battlefield, but in the battlefield of information. Our greatest enemy is not some distant country or abstract ideology. It is our own indifference. Thank you for spending this time with me. Share this video if you believe this is a conversation worth having. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future investigations. And remember, ask questions, always.